Coming up on the last morning of the program, I want to review some of the major themes that we covered over the course of this week, where we danced in and out of questions of Derech Eretz as they relate to individuals and interpersonal encounters, questions of Derech Eretz as they relate to communities, and questions of Derech Eretz as they relate to societies. Donniel, if you recall, opened the conference with some central categories: the journey from common knowledge, common sense, common decency, and common morality. I talked about the distinction between public and private, where the theater of the ethical lives. And throughout the week, we returned to those themes in a number of different sessions. Questions of the private and the individual that we talked about in terms of how we talk to one another, questions of discourse. I know some of your study groups studied questions of the relationship between parents and children. We also talked about that collectively in the intergenerational conversation. The panel that I did with Micha on Shabbat, in which we tried to get at the ethics of technology, or the virtues of technology, and the relationship between technology and empathy. In a number of sessions around public policy or around society, we again talked about questions of discourse as they manifest in the public square, questions of gender and how perceptions of Derech Eretz as a gender discourse is affecting our communities, and of course both Tal's perspective on Derech Eretz in public policy, as well as Donniel's talk about how to pursue a moral agenda for Israeli society, move us from the theater of interpersonal relationships to the broader societal questions that we're facing. As well, a number of sessions, both Micha's and the session yesterday, around leaders struggling to enact and to model Derech Eretz, either in the context of private communities or public communities. So without being too linear throughout this program, we danced in and out, as I said, of questions of Derech Eretz as they relate to individuals, communities, and societies. I know from having spoken to some of you that some of you are drawn more to one of these questions more than the others, and also that there's no punchline at the end, but that we are trying to get as both comprehensive and deep an understanding of this idea from within Jewish tradition on morality, dignity, civility, both for our interpersonal relationships as well as our societies. That's a little bit of a map of what we did. What we wanted to do for this session, and then there'll be one last closing session which talks about the relationship between Derech Eretz and civility and spirituality, which is one of the missing pieces from this week. But for this last session this morning, what we wanted to do was to open the floor for any of your questions that either you wanted to ask in a session but couldn't, or that results from your having thought about, put together pieces of what you've learned over the course of this week, or any other lingering questions that are emerging from the experience of your study. So with that, the floor is open. Yes?
The challenges to Derech Eretz or of Derech Eretz that we discussed this week, bring the question to mind, what should we be doing differently as we raise our children and our grandchildren? And is there guidance in the texts, or is there modern guidance so that the next generation doesn't face the same challenges that we face?
Go for it.
I am filled with advice to give to people on what they should be doing with their children. I'm also an expert on everything that other people are doing wrong with their children. So, my pleasure. I would start with something very trivial. And it's Aristotle and Baal Sefer HaChinuch, the person who, the idea of acharei ha'pu'ulot nimshachot halevavot, that after our behavior, that our behavior shapes our thoughts and our feelings and our hearts. And if we want our children to be menschlich and to have derech eretz, insist that they act that way. Just make a certain, words matter, how you behave matter, how you behave to other people. It's not, ethics doesn't begin with Philosophy 101 when you're in university. The notion that habit shapes not just your diet. Habit doesn't just shape your cardiological well-being. Habit shapes your Derech Eretz is a very, very beautiful and scary idea. And to be able to look at your life that way would be something, would be Aristotle's practical advice to you.
I want to share an incident that I had with my 7-year-old after the 2016 election. He said to me, "Mommy, I heard that the president who won," which is fine, there's 2 presidents and one won, "the president who won stole the votes. He cheated." So I said to him, "Actually, Azan, he didn't cheat. He won fair and square." But he said, "But he's a bully." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But he shouldn't." I said, "But he did." And I said to him in that moment, you know, the ends don't justify the means. That actually getting your facts right and getting your story right and understanding what's going on is more important than your righteous indignation and where it leads you to go. So I just wanted to give that as an example, just helping to clarify actual moments. But the same coin is, do you ever tell your kids about your own mistakes in Derech Eretz? Do you ever talk to them about real incidents, not just real incidents about the president, but real incidents where I messed up, where I did something wrong? And to my mind, I mean, I read a lot about child rearing because I'm young and I'm new at it, and I don't even know my mistakes yet. But learning by example, and it's not just the good examples, because there are 3 ways to learn ethics or virtues or cultivate virtue, right? One way is to learn about it, which we did a lot of that this week. Another is habit, that you actually train yourself. And the third is reflection when we make a mistake, is tshuva. And so I wonder the vulnerability of being able to say, you know, I made a mistake in Derech Eretz here and I want to explain why, how far that goes in helping a person understand that it's not all or nothing, but it's a process of continual refinement.
I just want to back up a little bit with this question by adding a semicolon and 2 parts afterwards. One is that how do we influence our children when they live maybe 6,000 or 3,000 miles away from us, physically, and in other ways may live in an entirely different world than we do? And the second thing that follows the semicolon is that, at least in the States, the connection that many people, even in my generation and certainly younger, have with Judaism is minimal. And so to ask about the texts, what we have to do is find a way to translate what we know about the text in a way that speaks to them. I was for 10 years the director of an independent Hebrew school that was located on the campus of Brandeis University. And when I got to the school, 100% of the families were unaffiliated with the synagogue. And I would ask them, why did they come to my school instead of belonging to the synagogue? And they told me, why should I go to a Jewish institution where a rabbi or a Jewish professional is going to tell me that I'm not doing something that I should be doing, or that I should be doing something that I'm not doing? I would very often follow that up with a question like, why are you good to the environment? And their response would be, because that's what any decent human being does. And then I would ask them, have they know that one of the 613 commandments is to take care of the environment. And the end of that conversation would give them a reason to be proud of being Jewish that they didn't have before. And I think that is a linchpin for us.
So just to I'll take the second half and then come back to the first half about geographic distance and otherwise, and it'll give me a chance to respond to the question of parents and children, which, you know, we've been answering from the perspective of parents to children, but is an equally powerful question in the other direction. So we don't, you know, when we're, at least as I understand, why we study these texts and why we are pursuing a conversation about the ethical through the prism of texts, where that very activity is something that like a tiny minority of the Jewish people is capable of doing and interested in doing. And I don't think we do that here at the Institute because we are trying to cultivate competency in text as its primary goal. Right? There are programs where and there are institutions that are committed to that, and I think it's really important. I don't think you would teach competency in text the way we teach texts. You would have to study them, you know, study language skills and so forth over a long period of time, and you would have to take for granted that you could sideline questions of meaning just to be able to understand what the texts say, and then eventually get to the questions of competency. I think that the reason we're studying Derech Eretz here in reference to texts is because studying texts has been the way in which the Jewish people has navigated the big philosophical, moral, political questions that it has been asking of itself throughout its history. In other words, this is how Jews are human beings, is in and with reference to text. Now, what that means is that when it comes to taking this back to other people, you know, our hope, obviously, is that it's going to be less interesting to the people who are not here for the most of the people who are not here to say, I learned a great new take on a Mishnah. I mean, I think it would be wonderful if that's how Jews talk to each other. That's wonderful. But what's going to be most powerful is when the activity that you do in a Beit Midrash cultivates the compelling moral imagination that can inspire others to believe that Jewish tradition is the instrument through which the Jewish people ask questions. Right, as Rosenzweig writes in the 20s, the Jewish people are not desperately in need of the production of more books. They are in desperate need of the production of Jewish human beings. And the reason we learn is to be in the business of cultivating Jewish human beings. So that's, I think, a little bit of why we learn in the way that we do. Not as much about mastery or competency of the material, but because it becomes a more fluid discourse for which we can talk about our moral and political aspirations. And on that, you know, just in terms of the first comment on geography and distance, I don't remember who referenced Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree. Was it Yershua? You know, reading that book was incredibly overwhelming to me as a parent also of young children because of its central thesis, which I think is morally obligating, that your children are as much total strangers as they are some way a replica of you. And even if they're not, it's not an interesting question empirically. It's an interesting question morally to say, what happens when you treat your relatives, your children or your parents, as total strangers in the ways that morally obligates you? Like what does it do differently to you to stop thinking about genetic imprint as being the only vehicle to moral obligation? Because there are ways in which we are sometimes kinder to strangers than we are to people who are close to. And then holding those two things together. What are the things that obligate me morally because you have my genetic material? And how do I become obligated because you're a total stranger or really different from me? And if that's the question, then geography in essence doesn't matter. Like all of those obstacles don't totally matter. Do you want to respond or should I open up?
Just one quick comment about Andrew Solomon and then one question. So the Andrew Solomon book is really about the parents of children with a whole range of very severe life disabilities. And the way we discuss
discussed the book sort of has not even reference in Shiur, didn't really reference that. So is this sort of a book that relates really to parents who are experiencing difference and have to figure out what their significance is to that difference? And that in and of itself could be a whole question about Derech Eretz. That's my speech. My question is, at least in my experience of the week, the only other tradition that we drew on from sources, whether it was in our discussions, smaller class discussions, or in the Beit Midrash, were the Greeks. I didn't see any reference, either in sources or discussions in other faith traditions around this question, to Christianity, to Islam. We obviously have the Muslim leadership initiative, so we know a lot about their perspective. So is that something we don't do which is relevant to this question? Did I miss those aspects of the sources? What's your view of the relevance of other faith traditions to this question?
The reason for the presence of the Greeks is not an accident, since they were the first to begin a systematic reflection on the telos of human life and on the meaning of virtue and how you create a virtuous life and a virtuous society. The absence of Christianity and Islam from the discourse is accidental. My basic instinct, which has been reinforced over the years of study of Christianity and Islam, is the remarkable parallelisms and similarities between our religious traditions on these issues. The lack of presence of either Christianity and Islam was not because they don't have anything to teach, but because of some of it is just accidental. It just depends on what are the sources that the teachers are using. But when it comes to the virtuous, when it comes to ethics, our traditions, you can almost cut and paste. Each one of our traditions has the same, almost the same teachings, as well as reflections of the same failures.
Okay, so I want to answer this from a different vantage point. Two pieces. Going back to the Greeks influenced the rabbis a whole lot. So it's not surprising that the Greeks would come up, meaning it's part of their influence. What I wonder to myself is, number one, which of our scholars, of our Jewish scholars, have mastery over that material, Muslim material, Christian material? I think that's an important question. So Noam Tzion has written about differences between Christian virtue and Jewish virtue. So there are people who do that, and in that sense, there's an accidental element here of who's teaching you and what do they know, essentially, or what do they study. But I think there's a different question, which I want to pose as a question, I guess, which is what's the value of Jewish particularism in this Beit Midrash space? That is not to say that other faiths don't have what to teach, because of course they have what to teach. What I'm wondering is, what is the value of specifically learning what Jewish texts have to say? Because if we're specifically learning what Jewish texts have to say, then we're not necessarily making you a promise that we're giving you the best that there is out there in the world. What we're telling you is that we're going to give you the Jewish that there is out there in the world. And I want to leave that as a question, because I think people come to this Beit Midrash and are expecting that for different reasons. Some people are expecting that because they think there's something powerful and mystical and different and important in the fact that it's Jewish. Some people are expecting that simply because that's a historical, intellectual. Some people are expecting that because of the mitzvah of studying Torah. There are a lot of reasons why people might come to that, but I think you're touching on something that's really foundational, which is this question of why Jewish texts specifically, right? Not just text, but why Jewish texts. And I think that's something that's going to take more than this panel, and it's something that we should all be thinking about.
I'll just add, if the Attorney General had made his reference to Romans 13 in connection to the family separation policies of the administration a week before I taught my shiur on public and private, as opposed to the day of, I would have brought Romans 13, because it would have been actually a good analogy and a good parallel. I'm happy to riff with you about that afterwards. Go ahead, Lori.
Full disclosure, it's not a question to the panelists, but it's a contribution to the discussion about parents and children. Whether distant or close, one of the most profound teachings I received in my life was from a teacher, not a Jewish teacher, a Catholic teacher, who actually turned me back toward to look at my Judaism. One of the most profound things he taught was, he said, my children are my university. And for me, I've carried that teaching all through my life. And it's not easy, especially when they're having their tantrums or whatever they're doing, but to not only model for our children that behavior, which we hope they will take on, but to be curious about who they are and what they encounter in life and what they're learning, and to try to be open to learning from them. So our children are not the vessels in which we pour everything we do and know so that they will become little me's, but rather it's a relationship, and a rich relationship with reciprocity.
I was thinking about being marinating on your public lecture about the distinction between public, private, Judaism, and morality, which you referred to this morning. And I feel that distinction is not helpful. That dichotomy is not helpful, because what happens in private always makes way in public. The day that you gave that lecture, that night, when I was reading the news, there was a CEO in Bell who had been there for many years, who was making $21 million a year, he's young, he's 68, he's in the full bloom of his CEO-hood, he's running this company, and he's felled by a consensual affair with somebody who was under his shin. So he has something that is entirely private. He has sex with an employee consensually, there's no issue of non-consensual, and now he lost his job. Think Eric Schneiderman, a public figure felled by what happens in private. This happens all the time. It seems to me that a distinction, that if somebody walks away from here thinking there's public morality, private morality, not helpful. Because to me, a more helpful thing is you should be the same person inside and outside. You should be an integrated person. You should control your appetite. The ability to control your appetite in private is going to serve you well. If you start thinking about private or public, you're going to mess up your life. That's true for leaders, but even more importantly, that's true for all human beings.
Can you just
The question is about the usefulness of the distinction between public and private, when in fact so many people are felled in public because of their misdeeds in private. And of course I share with you, Wes, the aspiration that you're talking about, you know, that your insides are like your outsides, that that's what we want out of our, I think there would be a collective agreement that the gap between personal integrity and public integrity by public servants is enormously missing. But I think the distinction still lives in all sorts of empirical demonstrations. The reason why a public servant gets taken down because of their private transgressions is because they are a public figure, and because those private transgressions have come to light. If they were not a public figure, it wouldn't matter. In other words, we rarely do care that much about the private misdeeds of ordinary citizens, but we do care about when private misdeeds of ordinary citizens actually become reputationally damaging to the public square. There's an assumption that that you can do whatever you want in the privacy of your own home, but the minute that it becomes compromising to your capacity to be a public leader, then you have to step away. So I just, I'm naming this as what I think seems to me like an empirical distinction, that and then to ask, why is it that and this is why the Clinton and Trump examples are so salient, why is it that we don't really care about people's misdeeds except when it actually is seen as damaging the public theater in which they operate. So I agree with you on the aspiration of where you're trying to go, but I still think it's worth trying to be descriptive of why we seem to implicitly value one of these arenas for where morality takes place over the other. Anyone want to add to that? Okay, yeah, Hannah.
My question is going to weave together something that Elana said, something that David Ingber said, and something that came up on the social innovation tour that I was on. How do you deal with Derech Eretz when people that you're dealing with have completely different foundational assumptions than you do? So, for example, you believe in equality of human rights, and you're dealing with somebody from a culture who has very strongly differentiated sex roles, and they weren't coerced into it, which would be a different issue, but they've chosen it. Right? And you could expand from something very close like Haredim to people around the world who have very different foundational assumptions than we do, and sometimes we have to violate what we think our own principles might be to deal with them, and that's confusing.
So in your question, you asked, how do we deal with them? So my question is, what's the goal? Meaning, if the goal is coexistence, right? Just plain coexistence, that's one question. If the goal is working together, a la Donniel's presentation yesterday, that's a completely different question. So I think the first thing one needs to do is one needs to clarify what one's goals are. Let's just assume coexistence for a minute. Let's assume coexistence. Ray Fink asked yesterday, coexistence, schmoexistence. If in the ultra-Orthodox community children are being violated, what's my responsibility for that, right? So even within that, there are two sides, right? If there are gross violations, there are things that need to be done and you don't want to be complicit. And then Devorah Evron said yesterday, adaptive change, things take time. How do you change from the inside? So what I think is the distinction that I tried to offer the other day is to say that oftentimes we decide who's a rasha, who's wicked, and who's ignorant, meaning they can be taught. And that's a very simple distinction for us. But I tried to problematize that a little bit, that it's not actually that clear. And the same way we're asking, how do you influence your children, and we're asking back, how do your children influence you? The question of being in relationship with people who are different from us, and not just viewing that as a threat, but actually viewing that as a learning opportunity on both sides. I'm not talking about where you have to be utilitarian and you have to make a deal and you have to work. That's a different conversation. That's actually politics. That's a different conversation. I'm talking about where there's no gross violation that's happening that you need to take care of, and you don't need to make an immediate deal together, but you're really just talking about learning being in community with somebody with whom you disagree on fundamentals. And I really think that there's an opportunity not to change yourself to be like them, and not always to change them to be like you, but to actually see that the other person is not from the moon, and for them to see that you're not from the moon, even though you wouldn't want to necessarily take each other's ideas on. I know that's a complicated thing to think about, but to meet somebody who has values and they actually prioritize them in different ways should be something that asks us to say, I want to think about my own priorities and why I've chosen this way of prioritizing things, and vice versa. So that's really what I'm talking about. It's not to be a wilting flower and pretend that the differences don't matter. And it's to learn from the differences and not to change per se, though some change may actually take place. But that's what Yehuda's talking about in the political and the private and the public. The public is the place where we're doing deal making. That's not what we're talking about. There are places where it's just being together. And that can be okay, even if we disagree on fundamentals. We even have some people in this room who may experience that over the course of this week. Hopefully, all of you at some point.
Issues of morality and decency are very, very complicated in the context of a social structure. And they require of us two psychologically different moves. On the one hand, connecting to the good, connecting to your knowledge of the good, requires a lot of self-confidence. It requires of you to get rid of a lot of noise and to say, yes, I know the good. And a large segment of moral life is just decomplicating your thought processes and becoming really clear about what's clear. It's not that complicated. And the psychological motivation or the psychological disposition is about connecting to what it is that you know you know. At the same time as your question powerfully puts forth, it's very frustrating when you meet somebody who knows something very, very different. Part of what Derech Eretz requires goes to that strange sentence that I mentioned yesterday. I know what it is that I know, but I don't know whether that which I know is correct. Now, that is, Derech Eretz requires you to know, and at the same time it requires of you modesty. And modesty is about recognizing what it is that you don't know. It requires of recognizing that you're not standing always in judgment of other people. It requires of you at different moments just to be silent and to hear. And as a result of diminishing yourself so that you can hear and maybe learn. This notion of the common good or the common ethics, or that which, one challenge of it is that very often the good is not, it's not common. But the other challenge is that, as you said, we have very different notions of it. And to be able, it's not held in, it's not that it's not common, it's not held in common. And to be able to dance between those two is exactly, I believe, one of the essential features of Derech Eretz. And you know, there's no prescription. Nobody's going to tell you, when is it that I know that at this moment I have to be silent, this moment I have to intervene. The old notion of the harm, no harm, doesn't work. You know, like your rights end at my nose type principle. But what about this person's kid's nose? Or what about the women in the community's nose? Or this part of that community? When do you save the other from themselves or not? It's worthwhile in this context to remember the two concepts of liberty of Isaiah Berlin. Speaks about that the foundation of freedom, the foundations of a democratic society, are not positive liberty, but they're negative liberty. Positive liberty is that you have a right to be free, to be all that you ought to be. While negative liberty is that you have a right to be free from any outside coercion or people telling you who you ought to be. Most dictatorships are positive liberty, where there is somebody who sits down and has a very clear idea about how everybody should act in order to live a fulfilled, meaningful, valuable life. And they will institute legislation and coercion, not for their own sake. Chas v'shalom. Nobody does anything for their own sake. I'm only doing it for who? For you. It's for you. Now, there is a deep part of the ethical that assumes that moves you in that direction. It's very natural. It's not for me. This is the good. I'm not gaining anything by it. I'm not gaining anything by it. It's you just, there's there's an enlightenment that you have yet to fully appreciate. That if I'm just do this and this, you will just be like me. And one of the deep fears of the Haredi community in Israeli society is their belief that the rest of Israel believe in negative liberty when it comes to themselves and positive liberty when it comes to the Haredi community. that people fundamentally want to enable the Haredi community all the freedoms that they deserve so that they could ultimately become just like us. Derech Eretz. So positive liberty, and to understand its temptation, it's inherent to the notion of the good. Because the good is not just good for me, it's the good. And if it's not just the good for me, then how do I help you too? But Derech Eretz requires you to also embody negative liberty, not just simply because the other has a right to be mistaken, but because maybe you know that which you know, but you don't know whether you know that which you know is correct. And it's that dance, that's why the whole theme of Derech Eretz is so beautiful, because it's not about rules. It's not about a Shulchan Aruch, a code, which will tell you, in this case A, in this case B, follow it. Here it is. We can guarantee you a right product. There's a sensitivity and a dance and a nuance, which the challenge of Derech Eretz is to improve it over and over again. And one of the ways we improve it over and over again is watch people when you talk. What happened to them? When are they with you? When are you not hearing and respecting them? That dance is one of the hardest dances, and it's an inherent challenge to embedded in the notion of the good.
My question is about actions related to commentary on public matters. Commentary. And I'll use an example. We received a pre-reading titled Mr. President, I'm Ashamed. When is that okay? But not in a personal sense, saying shame, trying to shame someone, is not okay.
The question was about commentary on public events based on, I think, was it your piece, Donniel? Mr. Prime Minister, I'm ashamed of you. When does the act of saying, trying to call out shame in public, I'll just answer briefly. This goes back to the public-private distinction. If the public square is the theater of the ethical, then you might argue that we have a responsibility in the public square to hold leaders accountable for their moral transgressions, not just the peccadillos of their personal life, but when their public policy is actually a source of moral problems. One would say if that's where the theater of the ethical is, that's where we have to live. I do think there is a fine distinction between trying to call out the ways in which we feel shamed versus trying to shame people. The goal of public criticism of a public policy is not to publicly shame the architect of that policy. The goal of that is to recognize that we are ashamed by the policies themselves. I think that distinction is huge and critically important, because then our business is not to try to make somebody else feel bad, but to signal that we are actually, we've become the ones who are embarrassed and humiliated because we are implicated as citizens of a society by public policies that we see to be damaging. I think one of the corollaries to this is that, and the mistake that gets oftentimes made, which I think is at the heart of your question, is that when people think that the place in which they're going to adjudicate moral conversations is in the public theater, then I should be in the business of shaming other people in public. And that's incredibly common. I think blog culture has been a huge feature of this. It's much easier for me to make a strong point about what I'm going to make by attacking somebody else than it is to make the credible, legitimate claim of my argument, because that's where our opinions are formed in the public square. But I think when it comes to public figures, I think a lot of that is a lot of what you read, and I think what's important and what's effective is to recognize that it's not quite as much about shaming others, but becoming conscious of the way that we are ashamed. The way we are ashamed. Did you want to answer as well?
All I want to say about that is that this is in the ethics of rebuke. We have a lot in the Torah that talks about the ethics of rebuke, right? We talk about the Torah in Vayikra in Leviticus 19. Right? You have to speak to, show the other person what they've done wrong and not bear sin because of them. And because of him, that person, it, we're not sure. And the interpretation is actually threefold, and let's see if I can get this on one foot. One is, lo tisa alav chet, don't bear sin, because if you don't say anything, guess whose sin it is? I mean, if you had the possibility to stop it, and you didn't stop it, well then, we're culpable, we're accessories to that. Velo tisa alav chet, don't bear sin, is also about the way that we speak, the way that we give that rebuke. The way that we give that rebuke could be in a sinful manner, which means here we are, Machiavelli again, right? And the third is that if we don't say anything, what's going to end up happening is we're going to be talking about it at our Shabbat table. And that's the sinfulness, because we're not really talking about being constructive. And to my mind, what all three of those have in common is that the goal is to be constructive and to actually address the problem. So the ways in which we use rhetoric sometimes to do that have to measure up to the test of, is this actually constructive discourse that's actually going to go somewhere? If my audience is a group of people who wants to be whipped up around an issue, then rhetoric is beautiful, it's perfect. But that's not supposed to be our goal. Our goal is, and one thing I'm very proud of in terms of working at the Hartman Institute, is that the op-eds that come out of our people are constructive. They put forth ideas, feelings about how we feel ashamed, but ideas of what we're supposed to do to move forward, descriptions of structurally what's wrong. And I think if it doesn't measure up to the constructive bar, that we're actually doing something to further the discourse and not just exciting our base, well then that's not Derech Eretz. That's not what we're supposed to be doing.
The issue of technology, I wasn't at the session on Thursday, on Shabbat. It is precisely in the blogosphere, or in that universe, where, since you don't see the other person, you're in very treacherous pace. Because when you see them, there's something happens to your connecting to Derech Eretz, that when you're sitting there at your computer, you don't see the other person who you're talking to, and therefore the viciousness that is very often very common is quite remarkable. I read all of the negative, but I make sure my wife doesn't, because she actually gets scared. She gets scared that why would somebody... So I have a general rule, and I'll tell you the exception. The general rule is that I don't debate people and mention them. Debate what someone else wrote in anything that I write. Over the last number of years, there's only one case that I did so, and I called him, and I told him I'm doing so, and I sent him my blog before it was to be published, and I asked him, could you please review the way what I am saying about you, and I want you to feel free to make any comments, and I will put them in, but I will describe you the way you, if I've, you deterred. I'm not going to go and, you said and I said. I gave him the ability beforehand to reshape exactly what it is that I would say, and I said, whatever it is that you say that you're saying, that's the way I will say it. And so that's a general rule, because there isn't it's so easy to lose your Derech Eretz. There is no doubt that this certain figures, it falls under the category, it's about a debate, not about the Prime Minister himself, but about, It really is it's the society which is allowing this. But all that said, and this I struggle with tremendously, and I don't. Again, it's this journey. I don't have an answer to it. There's a line though where you have to say enough. Now, if you have too many lines, there's something wrong with you. Too many lines, your ego, it's all about you. You're in a domain of public, of positive liberty, and you know what. If you have all these lines and everybody's aggravating you, and you know on too many issues what everybody should do, but there has to be a moment where you say enough is enough. And but be very selective. That was about at a moment where I thought it was simply unequivocal, because it had nothing to do with security. It just was a moment of profound moral failure for the sake of short-term political gain. Now, all of you, part of Derech Eretz requires of you that you speak up. But speak up softly and choose your lines. And that's why it's a journey. And know by definition that you're going to fail at it.
We live at a time of real uncertainty and anxiety, and all of these things publicly that turn our stomachs and upset us. And you talked about the conflation of the moral and the political and the partisan in another venue. And I was wondering if you could help us use the Derech Eretz lens to calm things down and discuss forward in a positive way. That would be helpful.
So the question was about, I've drawn a distinction in writing in a few places between the moral, the political, and the partisan, and trying to figure out whether and it's a time of tremendous moral and political unrest, and whether there's a way to use this category of Derech Eretz to move things forward. Part of the reason that I draw this distinction, and I've been having a debate with a number of folks here about whether that distinction really holds, the moral and the political and the partisan, because they clearly live along a spectrum, right? That our morality translates itself into our political ideas. Those are the places where we put our moral ideas into practice, and partisan is the team we pick in order to exercise our political ideologies. That's why I see them in relationship to each other, but I really do think that they operate as different discourses. I think that there are two central projects right now, given the culture of partisanship and polarization. And I'll talk about America because that's where I live and that's where I vote. And there's all sorts of interesting data about the ways in which partisanship is, if not at an all-time high, probably highest it's been for about a century. There's also legitimate moral arguments that partisanship is not a bad thing for a democracy. It actually refines strong positions and creates an effective political culture, and that sometimes an over-obsession with bipartisanship and with cultures of consensus actually doesn't move things forward and takes off the sharp edges of when there are actually vibrant debates to be had in public. But there's a great Pew study on partisanship and how profound it is, that partisan ideology is a much more profound differentiator when it comes to people's beliefs than every other metric. Right, economic power, race, gender, class, etc. Its partisan identity is a much stronger indicator. There's two central projects right now, and the problem is that they are basically at odds with each other, and I believe in pursuing both at the same time. In a hyper-partisan culture, one central project is to win. Right, so, and that's, the nature, and like, if you believe that your partisan position actually has really clear, there's real clear daylight between position A, position B, red team, blue team, and that those partisan ideologies are reflections of your political views, which are in turn reflections of your moral ideology, then there is a moral obligation to try to win. At the same time, I think there's also a moral obligation to try to get a society to recognize that most of its partisan difference does not have to hinge on total moral difference. if you actually see your partisan opponents as moral opponents, as representatives of a totally different moral worldview, it is almost impossible to live in community with them. If you make that decision about 50% of the American people, the long-term prognosis for building a society that is actually passionate about your moral values is actually weaker, because you've closed off the possibility of coalitions with people who might, if you interrogated it more deeply, might actually share some fundamental moral principles that they simply translate into different political expressions. So Jewishly, and through my work, I live much more on the side of trying to build moral coalitions, of trying to build moral consensus. As a private citizen, as a voter, I really would like my team to win. I think at minimum, I would love to see a way in which our Jewish community could at least be talking about these openly as two separate projects. I think if we don't think about them as two separate projects, we wind up collapsing them together. And I think that ultimately, not only does it make you weak, does it weaken your moral discourse, but you also eventually lose on a whole bunch of fronts. Yes.
Since I've been here this week, I feel like a lot of my expectations about what non-college students would believe have been shattered, and I hope that it's been reciprocal. And I just was wondering, to what extent the category of intergenerational problems is diminutive or false, and are problems just problems?
The question is, the questioner said that her experience here has challenged the idea that there's some really significant gap between non-college students and college students. I like that distinction. That's like how Jews divide the world between Jews and non-Jews. But that actually there are a lot of places in which it's not so clearly a generational distinction. There are problems and wide variety of opinions. Is that distinction false? And what would an alternative look like? Did you want to answer?
Sure. So this reminds me of the gap between American Jews and Israeli Jews, in a sense that you can probably find, the people in this room can probably find Israeli Jews who agree with them on lots and lots of issues. So sometimes when we present something as an intergenerational issue or an Israel diaspora issue, what we're really presenting is a right-left issue, right? Sometimes. That said, there are also different experiences that people in different geographical locations and people of different eras have, right? So for instance, you're growing up with a technology, you've grown up with a technology that most of the people in this room just didn't have access to. How does that change the way you think, the way you speak, what you think of your own voice, and how important or not it is? That there has to be something to that part of your experience that may not end up differentiating you, but it certainly characterizes your own experience. So I think some of this is sort of, and then you have also not just how you grew up, but also the events of the world around you and what you've seen, right? So I think that it's yes and, right? It's yes and. It's simplistic to suggest that what we're talking about is just a generation gap, but this, that, or the other. And it was just interesting to me, someone was telling me about was it the social innovation group that when you met with the Haredi woman, so there were some in the older generation who wanted to talk to her this way and some in the younger generation who wanted to, and then they talked about it as a generation gap, but then I found out that it actually wasn't a generation gap. It actually was just different people were interested in a different kind of conversation. Look at that. So our job, I think, is to figure out how we don't infantilize the other as, well, you're the older generation, so you think like this. You're the younger generation, so you think like that, while at the same time accepting that we actually do have different experience, and that experience shapes us in important ways that we can learn from one another. But I think it's a very important corrective, a very important corrective. Thanks, Eden.
I would just also add the presence of when you're not here, you can be caricatured. When you're here, you can't. And so that's an incredible conclusion to draw after this week of like this is a group of people with different backgrounds and ages and ideologies and affiliations and so forth, and there's a wide diversity of opinions. That's actually a powerful lesson that oftentimes doesn't happen because of the way that that community programs, almost by definitions, get siloed because of, for natural reasons. So it's actually very affirming to have you reach that conclusion, and I would not assume that conclusion would be reachable for the participants in a room like this without you being present. Yes, Sissy.
Okay, is that better? Yeah. Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, because as I've said before to you, this has been an incredible week and totally amazing and very enriching. So I thank you. But I have a question and really a sense of responsibility, if you will, to this group. So my question is, how prepared are you to go back to your communities and put yourself out there as a thought leader and have a discussion on the various topics that we have reviewed throughout the week? They are multiple, and I was just putting down a couple of them. The diaspora. What's the relationship of the North American Jews to Israel today? What's the sense of responsibility that both feel, not only the North American Jews, but the Israelis? What's the embracing that we want, and we want to have more? Probably all of you in your communities have been dealing with this question. How do we interest our community to be more involved with the state of Israel and to understand it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So how do we take the things that we've learned? The Arab situation. What have we learned about the Arab situation in place? And if we haven't learned, who do we ask? Do we come back to the Machon and we ask them to give us some talking points? I think that's valid. I think we all have a great deal of respect for their thoughtfulness and their intellectual capacity. What about the Haredi? How do we feel about the Haredi Jews in Israel as they feel about us, if we are not Haredi? And what are the questions that we ask ourselves and that we could be sharing with our community? What do we want to do with the information that we have? I was looking at our material. We've got amazing material. Is it our responsibility to write an op-ed piece for our Jewish newspaper or our general newspaper? Do we want to gather a group of people at home and have a discussion about what we've learned and listen to them? I use the word responsibility because I do believe that very deeply that each and every one of us has a responsibility. What do we do as an American Jew? How do I interact with my Israeli friends living in America? How do I encourage them to become more involved with our local community? You know, we have an exception in San Francisco in the Bay Area because we have the Silicon Valley and we have the pleasure of having a large number of Israelis living there. It's taken a long time to make both communities feel the compassion that each one of us has for each other, but we have to do more. So what do we do as a group with the information that we're learning and our own thought process as far as moving that along? I think it's really so important, and I really would love to hear what you're planning to do. And really, what are our expectations for the future? And what part are we going to play in that? What is our outreach to the Arab community and the Muslim community and our communities? Do we have an interfaith involvement? Do we want to? Do you have friends who are Muslim or other cultures? And do you reach out to them? And can you use the material that we've garnered here? Can you use that? And should you use that? So these are my questions, and I'm really very happy to have met so many of you, and I'm looking forward to having extended communications with you about what you're going to do. Yeah.
So my question's kind of going to veer away from Michael, can you still, I'm going to veer away from this conversation and kind of take it back to canvas a little bit, specifically regarding Israel. So like, I think like the Derech Eretz of like, speaking in like the liberation of other people's struggles, like through the
Can you be a little louder?
Yeah, so like the Derech Eretz has been a big theme of this week's, it's the main theme of this week's, this week's conference or learning. And for me, like the Derech Eretz is participating in other, like, liberation of other people's struggles and like through intersectionality, right? And so, my first question is, what is, like, let me just give some context, right? So this year, the UC school system had a tuition hike increase, and they were trying to increase the tuition for students, and there was a lot of like protests, and all the UC students were meeting at UCLA to like, to discuss this. And so there's like a big protest at UCLA, and like all the biggest labor union was there protest there. And like within minutes, like there was a lot of obviously like 90% of UCLA is Jewish, over 90%. A lot of the Jews are very active in like the political sphere of UCLA and the UC system in general. But then like within minutes, the tuition hike protest became about Israel, and it was all about BDS and divest. And so like my question is, to what extent do we withdraw from our own values to participate in the liberation of other peoples, and also essentially that's my question. Oh wait, I just add. And also, like, additionally, I want to know, like, how do we actively participate in communities who don't want to welcome us? Because, like, I was at that thing, and I was protesting tuition hike, and someone came up to me and said, "You're a Zionist, we don't want you here, you're going to Like, how do we actively participate in communities that are not welcome? So it's sort of like, what do we withdraw, like, what values do we, like, withdraw from, and then how do we join communities that are not welcome?
So the question relates to college campuses, but not exclusively, on showing up and participating and representing a certain set of moral values and moral commitments when they either explicitly or those climates turn to represent all sorts of other political concerns. And if you're told that you're not welcome in a union protest for your Israel politics, what are the consequences of that? How do you stay in it? Whether to stay in those causes on the belief. I think this is your opening line about Derech Eretz as connected to not just your own moral struggles, but liberation of other people and other people's moral struggles. I think that my personal view is that I think that your frame feels to me correct in that showing up in order to honor what you consider to be important and noble moral causes on behalf of both self and other is the central instrument to figuring out whether you're doing the right thing or not, and the central instrument is not who else has shown up and what other litmus tests are being used based on your showing up that somehow are thought to compromise the legitimacy of your moral claim. I think there's something very powerful. I think part of what we've been trying to dig at over the course of this week is what is a common sense morality that happens, that we have to take seriously even before we get to the question of, like, how does this play out politically in the world? I think it's very tragic when that students are driven away from participating on behalf of moral causes for others because of their political loyalties. But I want that to be about them and not about us. I would like it to not be that we then play in the game of evaluating whether this moral cause, I can't be part of this moral cause because it's filled with anti-Israel people. Then you're not actually talking about your moral commitments, you're just talking about other people. I know how difficult that is. And this is why when I was with a college student group, we talked about moral imperatives, moral concerns, and what does it mean to be loyal to our moral commitments and to stand in that breach. I ultimately think, like, if these are our foundational moral commitments, if this is our commitment to Derech Eretz, then the fact that other people don't want you there, I just want to figure out how to make it their problem as opposed to being our problem.
I just want to add two things that I've learned from students at Columbia Barnard. That I have a family member who works there. One is that we're in a transitional moment in terms of intersectionality, which means anything we say right now could change in 2 years. And I think that's critical, because it's possible that you could show up, people know you're a Zionist, and ultimately that impacts the conversation and the tenor of the goings-on, or it's possible that they'll keep telling you, don't show up because you're a Zionist, and it'll get worse. We don't know. So I want to just put that out there first and foremost, that we're in an experimental phase. The second thing that I've learned from them is that the moment of the protest is not the moment to negotiate the finality of this issue. There's a body of work. The body of work includes your relationships with your college members, with your co-students, all the time. So what I find among students is that people are having meetings with the heads of such and such protests, or coffee dates, or having discussions, and there's a community organizing element there that isn't just about the moment of being at that protest. And I think that's really important. Those two things said, the moment of protest itself. So what I've learned, and this I've learned from my family member who works at Columbia Barnard, is that what he sees is three basic responses. One is, I'm going to leave because I'm not welcome here. And you have to ask the question as to what the consequences of that are. You know, Yehuda just said a minute ago, if you're not here, you can be caricatured. If you are here, you can't. There's something to be said for that. Another is, I'm actually going to stay here because I care about this, because this matters, and hopefully my presence here will change some sort of discourse, and it isn't about guilt by association. And the third is, I'm going to stay here and somehow represent who I am in a sort of obvious way. However that means, whether it's everybody's chanting no walls from here to here and Gaza is part of the chant and you chant part of it and you don't chant the other part. But there's something, whether you're doing for yourself or you're doing for other people, to know that I'm here, I'm pushing with one hand and I'm embracing with the other, and how we do that. And I gotta be honest with you, at this stage, I think all three of those are understandable responses. And it's gonna be somewhat based on the individual. The only thing I would say is that because we have different options here, we need to think seriously about not the short-term consequences of engaging in one of those options, but the long-term consequences. So personally, I say show up and don't chant half that chant, and let people know who you are and meet with them afterwards and meet with them beforehand. Do I know if that's gonna make a difference? Time will tell. And people will tell. But there's a little discomfort whenever you're trying to make change. And in this transitional moment, to be able to say, I'm confident enough to be here as myself, and to know that no one should be telling me that I don't belong here. And I need to do something about that too. Those two things have to be held together. This matters to me and I show up, and I need to stop people from telling me that I can't be here.
A major takeaway, perhaps the thesis, Yehuda, of your lecture a couple nights ago was the need for the switch in Israel education, programming, and others from a narrative central to crisis to vision and imagination. So I'm wondering what you see as the operational, institutional, and other mechanisms to achieve that more so in the near term as opposed to just waiting for generations to grapple with it.
Yeah, so the majority of the work that I do and that the Hartman Institute North America does is in this space, in this project that we call the I Engage project, which is trying directly to shift from an advocacy-based orientation to education, in which, and I'm not, when I say that, I'm not eliminating the need for and the value for political advocacy on its own terms, but I'm trying to differentiate between when you educate towards an advocacy outcome versus when you educate for an education outcome, where by definition an education that's not for an advocacy outcome is fundamentally open-ended. If you really work in education, if you love education, you know that there's the possibility that you and the people in the room will draw totally different conclusions than what you set out to do at the beginning, and therefore it is much more vulnerable by definition. It's much more scary. I feel like a really good study of Torah should be actually a little scary because you don't know what's going to happen, and take seriously that has its own value. So a lot of our work in this space, and I think there are other organizations trying to operate in this space, is trying to create much larger platforms for rabbis and synagogues, for day schools, for Hillels, for people of other faiths, to encounter and be in relationship to Israel as this site of major questions facing the Jewish people, in which the goal is not tangibly oriented towards how do I get people to do the following thing, but is actually oriented towards the study for its own sake. The taxonomy that I oftentimes use to talk about this is that a colleague of mine, Ray Ringel, talks about 3 different indexes that one uses to evaluate public speaking. The affective, the behavioral, and the cognitive. The affective is how do you make people feel? It can be to rile people up, to make them like you. The behavioral is what do you get people to do as a result of what you're teaching? And the cognitive is what have you tried, what do people understand as a result of what you've taught? And that in the map of Israel education, our community's resources are heavily invested in the affective. Let's get people to like Israel or hate it. And overwhelmingly in the behavioral, let me teach you this piece of information about the state of Israel because I want you to do something very concrete, which is usually give money or lobby your congressperson. But there's a whole third sphere, which is what should we understand about the state of Israel, because understanding will form and shape our identities in long-term ways that ultimately may yield affective and behavioral consequences, but is measured for its own sake. So I'm happy to talk to you more about what the types of programs like this look like. The major liability to work like this is that you have to invest long periods of time over long arcs. There is no shortcuts to that kind of serious Israel education, and it's one of the foundational premises that this institute was founded on, which is if you want to engage seriously with the big questions of the Jewish people, you actually have to show up. You got to spend time. Your trips to Israel are not just the Yad Vashem float in the Dead Sea thing, but you're going to come sit for a week, and I think I refer to this as like a weird Torah vacation, and you're going to sit for a week and you're going to come away feeling in some ways filled up and in other ways still challenged, but at least in relationship to that which you are trying to take very seriously. Yes.
I haven't heard very much about the relationship between Palestinians who live outside of Israel and Israeli Arabs with the Jewish community.
No, I actually would like to speak about this. Just one small piece. I'm not going to give a long talk about this. I think the question related to Palestinians, I think when you said outside of Israel, did you mean over the Green Line? Over the Green Line. So Palestinians... No, not the Palestinian diaspora. Palestinians over the Green Line, Palestinians inside the Green Line who are Israeli citizens, as well as Jews in Israel. And there are obviously a huge set of Derech Eretz questions that relate to Israel's primary conflict, which is with the Palestinians. Just one small piece, and we talked, for those of you who were here last summer, we talked about this a little bit then too, and it carries over here, which is there has been a cost to the process of rectifying the moral conditions under occupation that has come about because of the way in which the peace process and the two-state solution has been constructed almost exclusively as a political process. In other words, there has been a lot of talk for a long time of, when we reach a final status agreement with the Palestinians, then we will be able, nobody says it exactly like this, but they're basically saying it, then we'll be able to address and rectify a much larger set of moral concerns about the conduct of occupation, because it will be solved by better boundaries, better borders, final status arrangement, diplomatic relationships, an embassy, an airport, etc. I believe that this has actually been one of the critical moral flaws with the process, is that when you say, at the resolution of that political process, we'll address all of these issues, it allows you to perpetuate moral indignities and to postpone your treatment of those moral indignities because you're subordinate simply to the political process. The problem has been that trying to rectify the moral problems is viewed as what's called normalization. If you made conditions under occupation much less problematic for the Palestinians who live there, it is viewed as actually postponing the political process indefinitely and getting people to normalize towards living under occupation as opposed to fighting it. So it's an exact example of how a political solution to a problem and a moral solution to a set of problems are actually at odds with each other, rather, and the further we get away from a political resolution to that problem, the more that we're actually sustaining a set of moral problems. I don't totally know what to do about that. What's intriguing to me is when you hear voices who are, for instance, among settlers or among far right wingers, who don't use the term occupation and who have who long term would like for Israel to ultimately annex the totality or near totality of the West Bank, who are actually loud moral voices about the conduct under occupation. That's what gets, those are that's like a challenge to our categories. And I am genuinely interested in trying to figure out, especially if we come to the conclusion that two-state solution is not imminent, then what are the incremental moral steps that could at least rectify the conditions under which occupation takes place that aren't actually, that don't get juxtaposed to ending the occupation? And including that, also, like, what does a serious conversation between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people mean about what it means to be a refugee? Can we have conversations like that that are not about creating political solutions to a problem, but are at least trying to advance better moral conditions?
Just very briefly, it's further evidence of how habit influences Derech Eretz. And the realities on the ground, even if that's not who you want it to be, and even if that's not the way you think you ought to be, the mere fact that you engage in a particular type of relationship, whether it is in your occupying of another people, or whether it is in your normalization of terror activity, whatever it might be either way, when something becomes habitual, it shapes your moral character. And I think part of the tragedy that we're facing right now is the habituation of immorality.
they're very let's say at that time, not very helpful or welcoming to Israelis. And he had just served the Israeli army. And his goal was to make relationships, to create relationships, and in fact, not the time of the rabbis, but beforehand, using the concept that an enemy is someone whose story you've not yet heard, and therefore to listen and to tell those stories and see the other as a human being. And that's such an important part of allowing the bridge to be built over our deepest fears and differences. But for you three, I need some wisdom, both politically and their therapists. And it's about the evangelical community, which we really kind of said but didn't really discuss several times. Their role, first of all, with the American evangelical community, and their role now with the Israeli political reality. Evidence, obviously, at the dedication of the embassy, was the main speakers were from the evangelical community. Some of them who may have had some maybe anti-Semitic connect, and the role that they're playing with the current government of Israel, perhaps even more important than the liberal Jewish community's voice in America. So how that's impacting that, and that's political. The Derech Eretz one is, I've done a lot of work in interfaith, and I teach at Catholic University. I do stuff with all sorts of racial groups, but the evangelicals, by and large, the American Jewish community, at least liberal, have not had a lot of contacts with. And now politically, that may be a mistake. But also, how do we deal with that? And what is our obligation to try and reach out when we haven't really done that historically all that much? So I'm looking for your wisdom, and your wisdom on those two basic issues.
Not being someone who's that engaged in either political interfaith, my engagement with interfaith relations is the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which, as you know, is not interfaith relations. That's not what it is. I think the question about evangelicals, and look, I come from the Orthodox community, and we're asking ourselves the same question about some of the things that the community that I come from is engaged in politically, and whether it violates some of the morals that we're involved in. So for me, it's personal and not personal at the same time. I think it pays to find out who in the evangelical community is asking these questions, and those are the people to reach out to. Because all change happens from within, and not only that, there are opposition parties in every group. And to think like that, as opposed to thinking of a group as one undifferentiated mass, I think is one of the ways we get into this problem in the first place. A few years ago, when I was at our Hartman Theology Conference, I was sitting next to a fellow, and I asked him, "Oh, where are you from? What's your affiliation?" Because it's an interfaith conference. And he said, "I'm evangelical." So I said, "What's evangelical about you?" I asked him, and he said, "I'm not sure," meaning that's the way that I was brought up and that's the way that I affiliate. And I think it's interesting to consider, not that someone has to not be true evangelical in order, but that there are so many different hues of that. And how do we engage? I mean, this is the desperate project, not just for evangelicals, for everyone. The desperate project is to be able to hear opposition voices within another group who are willing to engage.
I'm going to give you go ahead, Donniel.
No, please.
Just a short thing. I had a conversation with one of the, with a kind of a leading philanthropic activist in the Orthodox community who had been connected to John Hagee and part of the delegation that brought him, and had been working for years at connecting Hagee to the state of Israel. And I talked to him like the week after the embassy thing, and it was an illuminating conversation because it was not predictable. His project is not about endorsement of Hagee or Hagee's positions on a whole set of issues. He is driven principally by creating support for the state of Israel. That is his central project. And therefore, he's making a trade between issue X and issue Y. And the only reason I'm mentioning it is because I don't know yet what needs to engage with evangelicals, but there's an equally urgent and probably easier project, which is to engage with the Orthodox community about evangelicals. That I feel actually there's a tremendous opening, there's tremendous interest, there's capacity to do so, and to be prepared for the strategy, for the moral strategy for the Jewish people. On one hand, may be do whatever we need to do to create support for the state of Israel. A moral strategy elsewhere is hold fast to a set of moral principles, even at the cost of support for the state of Israel. I think that's actually a conversation that can be had.
Echoing some, I meet numerous evangelical groups when they come here. And it's interesting, there's also a huge difference in just as in the Jewish community, there's shifts in different generations. There's huge shifts. One of the core features of evangelical ideology is Tikkun Olam. It's one of the 5 core principles, and that causes numerous, especially amongst younger evangelicals, as to whether Israel, how Israel, and if Israel fits into their Tikkun Olam ideology. In general, and as an Israeli, and I'm very comfortable with creating political compromises, especially when you're the ones who have to pay the price of some of those political compromises. I'm just being very, there's certain returns. We're in a very lonely universe. We really are in a lonely universe, and as such, when people could be of assistance, there's an openness to that. There has to be, however, lines. Now, be very, very careful. This is just cautionary. There are people. There's national anti-Semitism, there's Christian anti-Semitism, there's Christian supersessionism, which you assume to be anti-Semitic, but which is not. You need to be far more nuanced on the issue of anti-Semitism when it comes to the evangelical community, or when it comes to the context of Christianity in general, which is in the midst of it's really a 2-generational shift post-Holocaust to develop a language of how do they re-embrace the Jewish people. Despite certain core supersessionist ideologies which are embedded in their essential faith commitments. And so you need far more subtle lenses when you do so. And in general, going back to what Elana said, when we live, or Yehuda, when we live in a partisan universe where there's blues and reds, there's college students and everybody else, or there's the Jews, the liberals, and everybody else. You're carrying baggages, and you broke them down. You're carrying baggages that aren't necessarily helpful. And in particular, especially, I've given up a long time ago worrying about who the Messiah is going to be. And I, as an Orthodox rabbi, declare openly that if Jesus returns as the Messiah, I will accept Jesus Christ as my Lord, if he comes back as the Messiah. We'll wait to that moment. No, I'm not going to be, there's a lot of things, if Muhammad, I'll wait. I could delay that issue to when the time comes, and until which time I am able to build many coalitions. And in general, I feel bad. Like, it's not fair. But we're only 14.5 million Jews. And Derech Eretz also includes how do you live in the land. and it's okay. Survival is a value too.
So my question is related to Arthur's question, kind of asking for wisdom. And one of the things that has been mentioned on this panel is the importance of learning and the importance of seeing ourselves as maybe not having fallen short. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to model that for us, kind of tell us, maybe a time in which you fell short in terms of your own standards for Derech Eretz, because I think, at least for me personally, it would be valuable to learn from you on that level, and not only on this very high intellectual level.
We just zoomed the camera over here.
All right. Well, I'll share a very personal confession. The question is, since this is a space of learning, for us to speak about places where we've fallen short in terms of our own Derech Eretz. Let me say one thing to begin with, which is Sissy's comment is from earlier is critically important to me, to this institution, because our hope for the world is that people come learn ideas and then live them out in the world, and not actually hearken back to this place as an exemplar or a beacon of Derech Eretz. I don't want to be that. I don't want to pretend that I am. But a place where we study deeply the questions of Derech Eretz and that people are better people as a result afterwards. If there's an impression, and we were nervous about this when we picked this topic, if you start talking about Derech Eretz, then you're acting as though you are the model of Derech Eretz, and that itself is not Derech Eretz. It's like a bit of a trap. So I don't make that claim for myself, and I know my colleagues don't either. We feel like we can study the tradition's questions on these and hope that people go out and live these values out in the world. I will say my own personal confession of where I think I fall short on this is that in a whole variety of ways, one of the core features of my job is to say things that influence people. It kind of is. I write public pieces. I teach a lot. I curate a social media presence, which is a phrase that exists in 2018. It's very easy to get caught up with my own voice, to be jealous of when my voice isn't listened to as much as others. And I see it happen. I feel it happen. To feel pressure to say something, even though I don't really have anything to say, in particular moments, and when that happens, and it happens quite a bit, or it's an urge that happens quite a bit, it's really a very big struggle to try to figure out: am I doing this work because I feel like I have because I actually am sincere about it, or because I am driven by a whole bunch of other motives? And when you get into that business, then, once you go down that rabbit hole, I feel like in those moments of questioning, I really feel like not my best self.
My turn. So I'm going to give you a category, Josh, and everyone else, and everyone who watches this. My category is patterns. The place where I slip up in my Derech Eretz, every day, every other day, is patterns. It's very hard to change a pattern. When someone speaks to you a certain way or says something, and you're part of that pattern because they usually say it that way, and I usually respond the way I respond, and it's usually not as conciliatory as I look, right, with all my smiling. So I actually think of it more as a category than a particular issue, which is I really struggle with not taking the bait. Meaning, what does it mean where something that triggers me is going to be present because I can't change that, but I actually have to decide that I'm going to disrupt the pattern. And then it gets worse because even those times where I try to disrupt the pattern, the other side keeps going in the pattern. And so I feel like I've done nothing. And one of the ways that I feel successful is when I actually see that over time, all of those failed attempts actually get somewhere in terms of changing the dance that I do with someone else. But that's my struggle.
On interviews, when they ask, what's your flaw? And your answer always has to be, I'm too much of a perfectionist. I'm too hard on myself, and I just don't accept, so I'm going to avoid. There's something that I've been working on for the last number of years, and it has to do both with my own personal Derech Eretz, and it has to do with the Derech Eretz of this institution. and that is the failing of enlightenment. The assumption of somebody who's enlightened and who knows something is that you tend to be very, very paternalistic towards others who don't share your enlightenment. And then what you really want to do is you want to tell them. You want to tell them. You want to shake them. You want to share the enlightenment, and you're very frustrated that somehow they don't fully yet get all that it is that you have to give. And there's been a number of places where this institution has suffered from the flaw of enlightenment. There were many years that the only legitimate assumption within the discourse of the Hartman Institute was the two-state solution, for example. And a one-state solution, you're moral barbarians. And even though we didn't use that term because we are polite, but it was sensed. For many, many years, there's a sense that ultra-Orthodox, get with the program. Just, come on. And when you start in one place, it goes to many, many other places. And it affects the way you teach, even though you never insult people. You take up all the oxygen in the room, which is fine when you're speaking to people who agree with you. And so as long as everybody who agrees with you is always in the room, you could speak that way, and then it's a collective massage, and you feel great about each other. But I don't think that that's Derech Eretz. I think that there are very, very deep, legitimate disagreements on many, many levels. And it goes back to the issue of habit, because I found that to be very, very constructive in my life. That if I want to begin to feel a certain way, I have to act a certain way. And just like I remember many of us here in this room, we are part of a generation where sexual harassment in the workplace became intolerable. It wasn't even something you even talked about beforehand. And all of a sudden, excuse me, this is intolerable. To the extent, as I said, when you watch, you can't even watch today Mad Men I can't even watch the show. There's something so, I don't think that we were talking with the crowd that show would have even been successful today. Or I hope it wouldn't be, like that there's something. But I remember, how is it that, you can't change, this is what is, and you say, excuse me, and I remember there was this, I think it was Yehuda who taught me this term, nobody talk. There's no body talk. And all of a sudden you realize, you act a certain way, and all of a sudden, something changes. I started to talk differently about Prime Minister Netanyahu, other than this case. I took it upon myself. I'm not going to talk about if you don't say certain things, if you take that leap of action, it begins to shape your openness and your willingness to hear. And part of what we're working on educationally in the methodology of the Hartman Institute right now is how do we shift. There's, again, in North American Jews, there's far more monolithic feelings on certain issues among certain age groups, and it's easier. In Israel, the groups are far more diverse. And we have to change our educational methodology, because people who are coming into this Beit Midrash, do you remember when I welcomed you the first day, I said, I hope this Beit Midrash is a safe place for you? We began to discover that it wasn't for a lot of people. It wasn't. They didn't feel respected. They felt spoken down to instead of spoken with. And how do you change your tone? How do you teach? I still know what it is that I know. But how do I just, instead of telling you this is what you must believe and think, put forth a question and have enough respect with somebody to share that once the question's there, they're going to think it through. They might come to a different conclusion than you, but there's more of a chavruta process. And again, as I get older and older, I like saying that. I'm about to become, and 60 is 2 months away. You tend to be more certain about the things that, the paths that you've taken. And it's a good thing. It's really a good thing to stop being so certain and to create more space for people to make their own changes and for you not to be prophetic. It pays for us Jews to remember that the prophets were the greatest educational failures in Jewish history. They didn't change anybody. The only prophet on record who had an impact on anybody was Jonah, and that's because he was speaking to the non-Jewish community. There was not one moment in the Bible where a prophet spoke and the Jewish people said, because you speak down to. And shifting that, you start here, you start with your practice, and that's something that I personally and this institution are working very hard to embody.